All right, back on the game. John Kurtz with you on News Radio KMAN, and I am joined now by my good friend Carrington Harrison from 610 Sports Radio in Kansas City. Now, I say he's my good friend. I don't know if he's your good friend if you are out there listening right now, because if you're a K-State fan, you're probably upset with the dude. Carrington, as much as I think you do a great job and a great radio show, you have not done much to endear yourself to K-State fans here as of late, including this clip from yesterday's show.
K-State fan, I'm going to say this, and I mean this as respectfully as I can say it. Nobody wants you. There is no package in which you are included in.
All right. So I'll just give you the floor here, C-Dot. You came from your Missouri fandom place a couple, I think that was like last week, and had people riled up. Now you're not pretty enough to get invited to the Sadie Hawkins dance when Kansas is. Why don't you just, you interpret, tell us what the interpretation is that we should have of these comments.
Well, first off, I want to say that I don't think it's my job or responsibility to endear myself to K-State fans. It's my job to give my honest opinion on what's happening in local sports. So the question was, is there a package that would include 4 Big 12 teams going to the Pac-12? And what's left out of that clip is me asking the question, why would the Pac-12 want Kansas State? I want to be clear here. I got a lot of respect for K-State fans because most K-State fans that I've come across are either K-State fans because they grew up in the area or they are alums of Kansas State. They're a very proud fan base. I've always had a great appreciation for that. But I think what's happening now and why K-State fans have found themselves so angry is I'm a big believer that once a coaching search happens, you find out your places, you find out your standing in the hierarchy of college football, how people sort of view your job. I would say in a real world sense, that's exactly what happens in conference realignment. Now that the deck chairs are starting to move a little bit, you get a clear picture of how college football and college athletics feels about your university. We have now seen 2 rounds of conference realignment. K-State has never been linked to a power conference. They've never been linked to the Pac-12. They've never been linked to the SEC. They've never been linked to the Big Ten or ACC. So where does that leave you? I don't mean that no one wants K-State and they're not going to play college football or not be a part of a conference. But right now, I don't think it's very realistic to think that the Big Ten is calling or the Pac-12 is calling, or the SEC is calling, or the ACC is calling. The likely outcome of all of this is K-State probably joins the American Athletic Conference. Now, maybe the remaining schools in the Big 12 and the AAC join together to create sort of a super conference of their own, but right now I don't think there is a logical landing spot for K-State in round 2 of conference realignment.
Well, I do agree with you that the most likely option is that the Big 12 stays together, these 8 teams stay together, or at least most of them, and it's some conglomeration of them in the AAC. I think the problem I have and the issue that K-State fans mainly have here is being singled out. Like K-State is much different than the other 8 teams that are left behind, Kansas included, and we'll get to that. I do not think there is very much difference in any of these teams in what they offer to any of those other Power 5 leagues, and K-State should not be singled out for that because nobody is really adding dollars that make sense to the bottom line for any of these other leagues if you're going to have to split the pie in more ways. And just for what it's worth, K-State has been loosely linked to the Pac-12 in some of these scenarios. I think the difference here is, and I'm not trying to get into any personal attacks or anything like that, but there have not been any people out there looking for a little bit of clout with some speculative information that hits the internet that turns into, okay, aggregation sites are saying, hey, here's a report, Kansas to the Big Ten. Nobody's done that with K-State in the Pac-12, but that doesn't mean that there have been things I've heard behind the scenes about K-State, Oklahoma State, and Texas Tech working pretty closely, maneuvering behind the scenes, trying to be a group that would be included in the Pac-12, potentially with Houston. It doesn't mean that TCU and Baylor are actually in worse positions than K-State right now because of their religious affiliations, particularly Baylor, and they also have much smaller enrollments than K-State has. So I think that's really the big issue here. There have been some whispers about K-State in a Pac-12 scenario, depending on how things would play out. K-State is in a very similar spot to everybody else in the league, and I think that's where it just really grinds, that K-State has been singled out. And I get for you, it's the local school, K-State versus Kansas, so we can go down that road too. I'm happy to because, frankly, I think, again, if you're looking at the bottom line, Kansas, even with their basketball program, is not adding much more monetary value at all. to any league potentially if they would be joining. Certainly not to me enough to say that they would feel like they have assuredly a spot at the table here at one of these other leagues.
The point you made there at the end, that's the one I'll answer first. I agree with you when it comes to Kansas State and the other schools, but I'm not talking to Baylor fans on an everyday basis. I'm not talking to Texas Tech fans on an everyday basis. So I don't disagree with you. I would have the same opinion if I was doing radio in Fort Worth, or the same opinion if I was doing it in Lubbock, Texas. I don't think those schools are valuable. Now, when you bring up the possibility of schools moving together as a conglomerate, I do think the conference realignment has told us any of these package deals where 3 or 4 schools are moving at one time are BS. That's not how conference realignment works. What about conference realignment over the last 10 years has told us that these schools move in unison? These schools do what I would say most humans do, which is operate in self-interest. Texas operated in self-interest. Oklahoma operated in self-interest. Missouri, Texas A&M, Nebraska, Maryland, Rutgers. We can go back and forth on what's happened. I think what's happening to the Big 12 is sort of like what happened to the Big East at the very beginning of the decade. You remember when, little by little, teams started getting picked off from the Big East. It was Miami, it was Virginia Tech, it was Pittsburgh, and then eventually you're just sort of left holding the bag and just left standing there with nothing. So that's what I think is probably the likely outcome and scenario. You follow this as closely as anybody, and I got a lot of respect for that. Would you trust Bob Bowlesby? Is he somebody that you would follow his plan? He doesn't seem like a very proactive individual. He seems like a very reactive individual. And the one rule of conference realignment is you need to be proactive. The Big Ten has been proactive over the last decade in conference realignment. The SEC has been proactive. The Pac-12 has been proactive. The Big 12 has never been that. And I think that's why you keep losing anchor tenants. That's why Texas is gone. Oklahoma is gone. Nebraska is gone. And we're certainly going to get to the Kansas aspect of it, but I guess to bring it back full circle with the main point is Kansas and Kansas State are relevant because that's where we live. Those other schools just aren't really relevant in a point of conversation because we don't live there.
That makes sense. That makes sense, and I understand from your standpoint, again, why it is that you wind up talking about K-State as opposed to Baylor and TCU there. And I would just say, too, I mean, look, teams are moving in twos, at least, as you brought up. It's not always just one team moving, which again brings me back to Kansas and why I don't think this makes very much sense in particular right now here at this moment. But it's been teams in twos, teams in package deals. And frankly, for Kansas, last time around with the Big Ten, it was going to be a package deal with Mizzou. I mean, Mizzou was going to do a lot of the heavy lifting there, and that's no longer there anymore. But the other thing is, from 10 years ago in conference realignment, I mean, everything was done except dotting I's and crossing T's for 4 teams to leave the Big 12 to go to the Pac-12. And it was going to be the Pac-16 with Texas and Oklahoma bringing along a couple of in-state schools with them. So we've come very close to that. I'm not saying that I think 4 teams going from the Big 12 to the Pac-12 is likely, but I think that's likely because the Pac-12, the most likely scenario there is that they get rated by the Big 10. And that's where all the national talk has been about the Big Ten is going after the Pac-12, going after USC in particular, potentially Oregon, Washington. You hear those linked as well. And that's what the Big Ten is thinking about. They're not thinking about Kansas. Like the Big Ten is about to be $13 million per school behind the SEC by 2024 when their new deal kicks in. So you think the move here, really, we honestly think the move in basically a week after the official announcement from Texas and Oklahoma to go to the SEC is to add literally the worst Power 5 football program out there. I cannot see how that makes any sense at all, and it does seem like some rumors have been planted and framed as reporting here just to really placate the ego of Kansas fans and play to the admitted insecurities of K-State fans around here. And I think that's the thing that I really want to stick up for because I don't see much difference at all between what each school brings to the bottom line of a conference they would be going to. Does Kansas have an AAU status? They do. Is Kansas closer to Kansas City? Yes, although laughable, the campaign to call it a suburb of Kansas City. Do they have a great basketball program? They do, but Stuart Mandel laid out some really sobering, I think, statistics yesterday about what Kansas basketball could actually bring dollars and cents wise to another conference. So I just laugh at this Big Ten stuff. I think it's a non-zero chance they wind up there sometime, but it is not happening anytime soon because the Big Ten has bigger shots to shoot right now.
I can't believe that I'm being forced to be in a position where I have to defend the University of Kansas. It's a very uncomfortable position for me. But my big, I guess, reasoning on Kansas is I think they have two assets that provide somewhat valuable. Now, it's hard to disagree with the numbers. I saw the same tweet you saw from Stuart Mandel about the numbers of what Kansas basketball could provide. But we can acknowledge, like, Kansas basketball is a good asset. Like, if you were going to incorporate that, if you're the Big Ten or potentially the ACC, like, adding that into the fold, I do think has some tangible value that you can point to. Hey, we're creating the best college basketball brand that we can, and we're also going to be one of the top college football brands. Like, I think that does have some monetary value. I also just look at Kansas, and this is me coming from a Missouri fan standpoint. Kansas has the foothold of the Kansas City television market. I don't like it. I don't always understand it. But if we're talking about what's Kansas City's college team, it's the University of Kansas. So I do think if you're a conference like the Big Ten and you're thinking about expanding your reach, planting a flag in Kansas City has some value. So I do think that eventually Kansas is going to get chose. Now, is it going to happen here in the next 2 weeks? We'll see, but I'm with you. That just seems like a really quick turnaround to go from, we know behind the scenes Texas and OU were working for 6 to 8 months, maybe a year to get that thing done, that Kansas is now so valuable they're going to figure this out in a month. That just seems like a really rapid turnaround, but I do believe that once all the deck chairs are sort of moved again for the second time, and we sit in 2024 and the SEC looks different, the Big Ten looks different, the Pac-12 looks different, I do think that Kansas is going to end up in one of the power conferences.
Well, I know that you like, and Carrington Harrison is talking with me, by the way, from 610 Sports Radio in Kansas City. I know that you like analogies like this, so we'll see how this one takes. But I think you're spot on there, and we agree, obviously, on the timing of this, because Kansas right now is, the Big Ten could text Kansas at 1:30 a.m., you up. Kansas is responding to that every single time. Right now, the Big Ten is sitting at home pre-gaming at 6:30 at night. They're not texting Kansas right now. That's going to be there at 1:30 if everything else doesn't work out. If they're not able to woo USC throughout the night, right? So it's not going to happen anytime soon, and that's why I found some of the stuff yesterday to just be pretty reckless, I thought, in putting that out there. The other thing I would say is, I mean, look, you can say, look, they are the team of Kansas City. I grew up in Kansas City. I can't deny that. It's everywhere, and it's annoying, and it's awful, and I know you feel the same way on that. But what are you actually getting in value there? Because the numbers broken down by Stuart Mandel here, the Big 12 TV deals were $250 million. He said 50% Bowlesby did was OU in Texas, so you're down to $125. Mandel, and this is something he told me when I talked to him the other day, and by the way, he really chuckled when I said Kansas to the Big 10. TV deals are 80% football, so if you're taking 20% of 125, you're left with $25 million. That's the max value that you could get from Kansas basketball being on TV, which is one half of what the Big Ten makes in TV per school. AKA, you add Kansas to the league, then you have to distribute it another way. You're just not making money. So it's not adding to the bottom line here, and that's going to be the big thing that the Big Ten is chasing, because the SEC is set to be $13 million per school ahead of them here by 2024 when their new deal kicks in. And the other thing I would tack on to that is, I don't think Kansas basketball is as bulletproof as everybody would envision it to be, because think of UConn. I mean, you brought up the Big East earlier. They won 4 national championships, and they all occurred in the last 22 years. So they have 2 since 2011, right? I mean, that's more than what Kansas has done on a national stage in college basketball. UConn had pretty bad football, and look at what has happened to them. Look what they wound up with. Kansas football is in a much worse space than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago in conference realignment, KU was coming off of a run where they had averaged 8 wins a year the 5 years before, because they had that run with Mangino. Right now, they're going through one of the worst stretches we've ever seen in Division I Power 5 football this side of K-State in the 80s. So I do not think it's a guarantee that they get in somewhere just because of that basketball program.
To go back to an analogy, and then I'll answer that point, what I think is happening to the rest of the Big 12. So let's assume in this analogy, like the Big 12 has like some famous friends that can get you into all the Hollywood clubs. You can get into the nice restaurants. Well, on that night, Patrick Mahomes isn't coming with you. Steph Curry isn't coming with you. And now the entourage, the posse, has to figure out a way to get into the club for free. And I think the club promoters are saying, we know Patrick, we know LeBron, we know Steph Curry, but we don't really know you like that. So you got to go to the back of the line and you got to pay. And that's what I think is happening to the other 8 schools right now in the Big 12, that now you don't have those anchor tenants of Texas and Oklahoma. I think they're sort of seeing that the rest of college football and college athletics really rolled with them because Texas and Oklahoma kind of co-signed and vouched for them, but that's not what's happening right now. To your point about Kansas, I I wonder how Kansas sort of measures up to Rutgers, because Rutgers did get chose. Now, we're talking about a much bigger television market in the New Jersey area than what Kansas would have in the Kansas City area. But if we want to talk about football irrelevance, I can't think of anything that Rutgers has done in the last 30 years of college football outside of the couple of years they had Ray Rice. But they were at the forefront of being chose when it comes to conference realignment because of the Big Ten wanting to align themselves and plant the flag in the area. I think that would probably be the comparison for Kansas. Like, if we're thinking of over the last 15 years, who have been the teams that have moved conferences and why did they move conferences? Nebraska has a national college football brand, that they don't have the same television exposure that maybe a school like Kansas would have, or Missouri or Texas A&M, or Colorado or Utah would have, but also they're nationally relevant, and it makes a lot of sense for the prestige of your brand. I think the Kansas comparison would have to be Rutgers. They would be the worst college football team that has moved in the last 30 years.
Yeah, you bring up Nebraska, but the point there is Nebraska brings football value. They bring an entire state worth of not only resources that they pump into their football program and facilities and all of that, but the eyeballs that are there. And last time around in conference realignment, it was just so much more based on TV markets than it is this time around. I think this time around, it's much more based on, like, hey, what are the overall values going to be of these contracts as things start to move more towards streaming and people are cord cutting, and it's a different kind of environment. So I think at the time, and I think like you could speak to this with Missouri too, at the time 10 years ago, it was so much more about, hey, we need these markets. So Rutgers getting into New York, New Jersey, which still seems kind of stupid, to be honest, at this point in time, that's why that happened. And I think Missouri Missouri brings St. Louis and Kansas City, right? And kind of, another thing I could get at with you here is I think that Missouri won the birth lottery basically by where they are located, and that's the only reason they are somewhere different than K-State is in right now position-wise, just because based on if it were a meritocracy, that would not at all be the case. So I think those are just a lot of the frustrations that exist here, and why I don't think it's a shoe-in that Kansas gets anywhere. And to use your example, I guess the closing line here on Kansas is, if this is the Sadie Hawkins stance, we're not talking about Kansas being the most popular girl in school, the prom queen, and K-State being the nerdy band girl with braces. The difference is not that at all, because what we're talking about ultimately is, what do you add to a school? Another thing I'll throw in that Kansas has working against it that I've heard, and this is, again, something from the Pac-12 side that I've heard, they don't like the fact that Kansas doesn't have an airport. Like, you can't actually charter a flight in there, and these are things that can be sticking points in conference realignment. Everybody has to go to Topeka to charter a flight to go play Kansas, which, again, would tell you it's more a suburb of Topeka than it is Kansas City, by the way, because guess where people are flying in? Topeka, because it's closer. I digress. There are things that we don't talk about that are working against Kansas, and everybody gets blinded by the basketball program, which I also think is kind of a farce in terms of being a guarantee. So that'll be the final word there on Kansas. I'll let you close with whatever it is you want to here.
I actually 100% agree with you when it comes to Missouri. Missouri was only chosen because of where it's located, and the SEC was able to say that they planted a flag in Kansas City. Now I get to watch the SEC network, and they were able to plant a flag in St. Louis. So I don't disagree with you. I would also argue that that's life. Clark Hunt only owns the Chiefs for one reason. His dad owned the Kansas City Chiefs. Not like Clark started some business when he was 21 years old and hit it big as some tech giant. His dad owned the team. His dad died. His dad gave the team to him. So I think that part of it is life. But I agree with you. Missouri was very fortunate based on the geographical location. I would guess that Kansas is probably going to be fortunate for a lot of the same reasons that Missouri was. Closer to Kansas City than Manhattan, has a bigger profile and exposure in Kansas City than what K-State does. And again, I think they have something that eventually you're going to be able to hand the Big Ten and say, all right, this is our checklist of why we should be included in your club. AAU University, top flight college basketball program, the number one college in a college crazy market, which is Kansas City. I think those bullet points on their Wikipedia page eventually gets them into somebody's power club. It could be the Big Ten, it could be the ACC, maybe the Pac-12 is thinking about expanding more into the Eastern time, or the Central and Eastern time, and they eventually pick up Kansas. But I think those bullet points eventually get Kansas chosen. And again, I think when the dust all settles, I think K-State will probably be in the American Athletic Conference, which I don't think is a bad conference. Now, it's a step down from where Kansas State has been for the last 50 years in terms of their conference standing, but the American Athletic Conference, if you add Kansas State, Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, and you add them to the American Athletic Conference, that's a strong conference.
Yeah, I think where we disagree is like I look at it more and see, again, I don't think the things that we rattled off about Kansas really add much to your bottom line. And I also think Kansas being dragged down by the worst Power 5 football program we've seen in a long time, being dragged down by, look, an athletic department that's been an absolute freaking mess. Just a mess. I mean, the last 10 years in that athletic department have been a total mess. They have a football coach and athletic director like leaving mired in scandal and everything that those guys did while they were there. Kansas is not, I know they have new leadership in there in place that seems like they're actually competent at this point, but it's not exactly on stable footing here at this point in time. We'll see how it plays out moving forward, but I think there are more demerits to them than what is being really reported out there. And I also think, again, you just have to think of it from the Big Ten standpoint. Like, what do they gain with a new commissioner that needs to make a big move with the pressure of the SEC and Oklahoma and Texas? We're talking about the big leagues, and Kansas, like it or not, is in the minors with the rest of these 8 teams here. So if it comes back around because they have just a couple tiny marks in their corner that are above the rest of the 8 and they get in somewhere, all right, fine, so be it. But I don't think it's nearly as likely as they think it is, and I don't think that it's something that's going to be imminent. Maybe that's the perfect way to end it here, right? Imminent. Let's just bring up the word imminent. I don't think it is imminent.
John, I do want to point out that I want to be clear to everybody. There's nothing I would love more than for a decade of making Kansas won the Mountain West Conference joke. Like, there's nothing I would love more. It's not like I'm here advocating, like, Big Ten, pick Kansas. There's nothing I would love more than to see KU lose the Sun Belt Conference in football. There's nothing I would love more than that. So I don't want anyone to think that I am now siding with Kansas all of a sudden. No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to look at this thing objectively, and that's the conclusion that I've come with. The only issue I have today with you, Kurt, is you picked Thank Me Later over Take Care, and that's not an opinion that I can accept.
Oh, man, I've been vibing to Thank Me Later lately. That's such a good album. You got to admit, like, that's underrated. I feel like we don't talk about it enough.
Yeah, we shouldn't talk about it enough because it's like Drake's 6th best project. That's why we don't talk about it enough.
Oh, man, you're killing me. Go listen to The Resistance and get back to me, C-Dot.
I appreciate it, John. Thanks for having me on today, man.
All right, take care, dude.